The morning sun cast golden ripples across Cedar Lake as I stood on what was now officially my property. After 15 years of saving every spare dollar from my accounting job, I had finally purchased my dream home. It was not a mansion by any measure, but the modest three-bedroom lakefront property represented everything I had worked for. The wooden dock, extending 20 feet into the clear water, felt like a pathway into my future, and I could already imagine countless peaceful mornings watching herons fish while drinking my coffee. My first week in the neighborhood passed in a blissful haze of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough, offering friendly waves as they walked their dogs past my driveway. Mrs. Hernandez from next door brought over a homemade casserole, and the retired couple across the street invited me to their weekend barbecue. Cedar Lake Estates felt like the perfect community I had always dreamed of joining. The bubble of perfection first developed a tiny crack when I was reviewing my closing documents. Buried in the thick stack of papers was a brief mention of mandatory membership in the Cedar Lake Estates Homeowners Association. The annual dues were reasonable at $400, and the agent had assured me it was just basic maintenance for common areas and the community dock. Having grown up in a neighborhood without an HOA, I felt a twinge of concern but dismissed it as needless worry. 2 weeks after moving in, I received a formal invitation to the monthly HOA meeting. Curious to meet more neighbors and learn about community events, I arrived early at the recreation center. The meeting room filled quickly with about 40 residents, most appearing to know each other well. At precisely 7 o'clock, a slender woman with impeccably styled silver hair called the meeting to order. "Good evening, everyone. I am Alina Winters, board president for the past 11 years, she announced with obvious pride. First order of business is violations and compliance issues. For the next 40 minutes, I watched in growing discomfort as Alina methodically listed infractions committed by various homeowners. Her tone carried a smug authority that made several grown adults shrink visibly in their seats. One elderly man was chastised for hanging bird feeders without prior approval. A young couple received a formal warning for planting non-approved roses in their front garden. The meeting felt less like a community gathering and more like a disciplinary hearing. And finally, we have 3 unauthorized fence installations that must be removed by month end, Alina concluded, shuffling her papers into a neat stack. Any questions before we move to committee reports? I raised my hand tentatively, introducing myself as a new resident when acknowledged. I was wondering about community events or welcome activities for new homeowners. Alina's smile did not reach her eyes. We focus on maintaining property values through strict compliance with bylaws. Social activities are not our priority, but you are welcome to propose something at next month's meeting. After submitting proper paperwork, of course. The chill in her response was unmistakable. As the meeting concluded, several neighbors offered sympathetic smiles but quickly dispersed. I walked home with a growing sense that Cedar Lake Estates might not be the friendly paradise I had imagined. That weekend, I drove to the storage facility where I had been keeping my most prized possession, a 24-foot fishing boat that had been my weekend sanctuary for over a decade. With the help of a friend, I towed it home and parked it in my driveway, planning to arrange proper dock storage after completing my unpacking. As we secured the boat cover, I noticed Alina watching from down the street, her expression unreadable. I waved politely, but she turned away without acknowledgement. 3 days later, I would discover just how significant that moment had been. The bright orange violation notice taped to my front door marked the beginning of a neighborhood war I never intended to start. The bright orange violation notice fluttered against my front door as I returned home from work on Tuesday evening. The official letterhead and formal language felt like a slap across the face after a long day at the office. Immediate removal required. Watercraft storage in residential driveways strictly prohibited per Section 8.3 of community bylaws. Compliance required within 48 hours to avoid penalties. I pulled the notice free from the tape and carried it inside, dropping my work bag on the kitchen counter with a frustrated sigh. During the home buying process, I had received a digital copy of the HOA handbook, but had only skimmed its 80 pages of regulations. That night, I poured a glass of iced tea and settled at my dining table to read every word of the document. The search for Section 8.3 led me to page 47, where the handbook indeed stated, "No watercraft, recreational vehicles, or trailers may be stored in residential driveways or visible from the street." My heart sank until I continued reading and discovered Addendum C on page 74, which mentioned exceptions for waterfront property owners with appropriate documentation and board approval for temporary seasonal storage. Armed with this information and printouts of both sections, I decided to attend the HOA board meeting scheduled for the following evening. The same 40 residents gathered in the recreation center, with a leaner presiding over the proceedings with military precision. I waited patiently for the public comment period, raising my hand repeatedly for 20 minutes before finally being acknowledged. "I received a violation notice about my boat," I explained, standing to address the board members seated at the front table. "But I believe there might be some confusion. According to Addendum C, waterfront property owners have exceptions for temporary storage." Eleanor barely looked up from her agenda. "Addendum C requires prior board approval, which you did not request or receive. The rules are perfectly clear to everyone else in the community." Her dismissive tone elicited scattered nervous laughter from several residents. "I am new to the neighborhood and did not realize." "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse," Eleanor interrupted. "The board has spoken. Remove the eyesore immediately or face escalating penalties. Next item on the agenda." I remained standing for a moment, stunned by the abrupt dismissal of my concern. As I sat down, the man beside me whispered, "Do not take it personally. Eleanor enforces her pet rules aggressively against everyone." 3 days later, a second notice appeared on my door, this one outlining a schedule of fines starting at $100 for the first week, doubling each week thereafter. The language had escalated from regulatory to threatening, with bold text warning of potential property liens for noncompliance. My frustration grew into anger as I carefully folded the notice and added it to a new file folder labeled HOA Correspondence. That evening, my next-door neighbor Tom visited with a thermos of coffee and an expression of sympathy. We sat on my back porch overlooking the lake, and his revelations about neighborhood politics were both enlightening and disturbing. "The previous owners of your house sold because of Eleanor," he confided, his voice lowered despite our private location. "They had a pontoon boat they kept on the property during summer months. Eleanor made it her personal mission to drive them out." "That seems extreme for a boat," I replied, watching a heron stalk fish near my dock. Tom shook his head solemnly. "This is just the beginning. Eleanor has served as president for 11 consecutive years despite bylaws limiting terms to 3. No one challenges her because those who do suddenly find themselves under scrutiny for every possible violation." "How does she maintain control for so long?" I asked. "Annual elections happen during January meetings when half the community is away for winter," Tom explained. "She schedules them strategically and notifies only her supporters. Most residents have simply given up fighting the system." As Tom left, his parting words echoed in my mind. Your property is directly across from Alina's view. Your boat blocks her lakefront vista. This is not about rules, it is personal. That night, I decided that simply removing my boat would not solve the underlying problem. If I capitulated now, I would face years of selective enforcement and petty tyranny. Instead, I began formulating a different approach, one that would require research, patience, and strategic thinking. The following morning, I called my office to request a personal day and prepared to visit the county record's office. The county record's office occupied the basement level of a government building downtown, smelling of old paper and floor polish. After explaining my request to the clerk, a woman with kind eyes and 20 years of experience judging by her service pin, I waited as she disappeared into a back room. 15 minutes later, she returned pushing a cart with several heavy folders. These are all the property records for your address going back to the original development, she explained, setting the stack on a table. The oldest documents are on microfilm if you need them, but most people start with the deed history from the last 50 years. Thank you, I replied, settling in for what would clearly be a long day of research. The first folder contained the expected recent history. The previous owners purchased 12 years ago, their sale to me, and standard property tax assessments. Nothing unusual appeared until I opened the second folder containing yellowed papers from the late 1970s. My heartbeat quickened as I unfolded the original covenant documents from 1978, predating the HOA's formation by 15 years. The founding documents revealed something Alina had never mentioned: special provisions for waterfront parcels, explicitly protecting owners' rights to water access and reasonable boat storage. According to these original covenants, lakefront property owners were granted permanent and transferable rights to reasonable watercraft access, storage, and dock installation appropriate to the property's waterfront status. I carefully photographed each relevant page with my phone, hands trembling slightly with the significance of the discovery. The clerk noticed my excitement and smiled knowingly. "Finding something interesting?" she asked. "Very," I confirmed. "Do you happen to know when the Cedar Lake Estates Homeowners Association was officially formed?" She nodded, pulling an additional folder from beneath the counter. That would be 1993. Many of the lake communities formed HOAs around that time. Here are the original incorporation documents. Hours blurred into days as I continued my research, taking vacation time from work to build a comprehensive understanding of the neighborhood's legal structure. The picture that emerged was fascinating. The HOA had been formed 15 years after the neighborhood's establishment, with waterfront properties maintaining grandfathered exceptions to certain restrictions. More concerning, I discovered evidence of systematic bylaw amendments that gradually eroded these original rights. Every few years, small changes were approved during sparsely attended meetings, often with minimal notice to residents. The pattern suggested a deliberate strategy to consolidate power and override founding protections. After 3 days of intensive research, I scheduled a consultation with Patricia Chen, a real estate attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Her modern office overlooking the city center projected confidence and competence as she reviewed my growing file of evidence. "This is actually quite interesting," she murmured, examining the timeline I had created. "The HOA appears to have systematically eroded waterfront rights through incremental bylaw amendments without proper owner consent. And you say the current president has served for 11 consecutive years." "Yes," I confirmed, "despite bylaws limiting terms to 3 years. Patricia leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "There are multiple issues here. First, your original deed clearly includes riparian rights with specific provisions for boat storage. Second, the HOA bylaws amendments appear to have procedural deficiencies. And third, the governance structure itself seems to have deviated from proper democratic processes." "What does that mean for my situation?" I asked. "It means you have solid grounds to challenge not just the boat violation, but potentially the authority of the current board itself," she explained. "But be prepared. HOA disputes can become highly personal and contentious. These board members are your neighbors, after all." Her warning resonated with me, but I had already passed the point of simply wanting to park my boat in peace. The systematic abuse of power and selective enforcement had transformed this into a matter of principle. Before leaving her office, I requested that Patricia prepare a formal legal opinion letter regarding my property rights and the problematic governance issues. That evening, I took research in a different direction, creating a spreadsheet to track board membership over the years. The pattern was disturbing. While most positions saw regular turnover, Alina had maintained her presidency through 3 different election cycles when term limits should have forced her out. Further investigation revealed those elections had been held during special sessions with minimal notice, often when many residents were traveling. More concerning was what I discovered about Alina's personal connections. A simple business entity search revealed she held a 25% ownership stake in Cedar Lake Marine Storage, the approved off-site boat storage facility charging residents $350 monthly. The flagrant conflict of interest explained her aggressive enforcement of boat restrictions and refusal to consider exceptions. As pieces of the puzzle fell into place, I began formulating a strategy that would address not just my individual case, but the broader governance issues affecting the entire community. The next morning, I submitted a formal request for a hearing before the full board, citing specific bylaw provisions requiring due process for property owners facing enforcement actions. Their response arrived via email at 11:58 p.m. Friday night, a thinly veiled attempt to minimize my preparation time by scheduling the hearing for 8:00 a.m. Monday. They clearly expected me to arrive flustered and unprepared. They had no idea how ready I was becoming. The certified letter arrived 6 weeks into our dispute, its official appearance marking a significant escalation. Inside, a formal notice informed me that the HOA was preparing to place a property lien to cover $2,800 in accumulated fines for my continued noncompliance with watercraft storage regulations. My stomach knotted as I calculated the potential damage this could inflict on my credit score and future financing options. The letter concluded with a perfunctory invitation to resolve this matter amicably by immediate payment and boat removal. The passive-aggressive tone of the document perfectly captured Alina's approach, presenting unreasonable demands as generous opportunities for compliance. That same evening, returning from work, I discovered a handwritten note tucked into my door frame. Unlike the official communications on HOA letterhead, this message was scrawled on plain notebook paper. "People who fight the HOA do not last long in Cedar Lake. Save yourself the trouble." The implied threat contained no signature, but the handwriting resembled notes I had seen on the community bulletin board in Alina's distinctive penmanship. Rather than intimidating me, the veiled threat galvanized my resolve. The following morning, I contacted a security company and arranged for the installation of high-definition cameras covering my property from multiple angles. The technician positioned them discreetly under the eaves, ensuring comprehensive coverage of my driveway, dock area, and the perimeter of my home. Pretty serious setup, the installer commented as he configured the system to send alerts to my phone. Expecting trouble. Just being cautious, I replied, not wanting to explain the increasingly hostile neighborhood politics. The investment paid dividends almost immediately. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, my phone chimed with a motion alert. The live feed showed Alina and Richard Barnes, the HOA treasurer, walking along my property line. They moved with purposeful strides, stopping occasionally to take photographs of my boat and property. Their animated conversation included pointing toward my dock and making notes on a clipboard. I downloaded and saved the footage, adding it to my growing file of evidence. Their unauthorized inspection of my property without prior notice violated both state law and the HOA's own bylaws regarding property access. More importantly, it demonstrated a pattern of targeted harassment that would prove valuable in any legal proceedings. My continued research revealed something even more disturbing. Cedar Lake Marine Storage, the approved off-site boat storage facility charging residents $350 monthly, listed Alina Winters as a principal investor in business filings with the state. The discovery of this flagrant conflict of interest explained her aggressive enforcement of boat restrictions and her refusal to consider reasonable accommodations. Armed with this knowledge, I formally requested a hearing before the full board, citing specific bylaw provisions requiring due process for property owners facing enforcement actions. Their response arrived via email at 11:58 p.m. Friday night, a thinly veiled attempt to minimize my preparation time by scheduling the hearing for 8:00 a.m. Monday. They clearly expected me to arrive flustered and unprepared. Throughout the weekend, I meticulously organized my evidence and prepared a detailed presentation with Patricia's guidance. We developed a clear strategy focusing on three main points: my grandfathered waterfront rights, the procedural violations in bylaw amendments, and the conflict of interest in enforcement actions. Sunday evening, a knock at my door revealed Tom from next door, his expression concerned. "I heard about your hearing tomorrow," he said quietly. "I wanted to let you know that several of us are planning to attend. You are not the first person Alina has targeted, but you might be the first with the resources and determination to fight back effectively." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely moved by the show of support. "Has anyone else challenged her before?" Tom glanced down at his shoes. "The Richardsons tried 3 years ago when they were fined for their holiday decorations. Somehow, anonymous complaints about their property started appearing weekly. Their children began having trouble with the neighborhood kids. Eventually, they sold and moved away." His warning was clear. This dispute could escalate beyond legal arguments into personal territory. As if to confirm this prediction, I received a call from my supervisor the following morning as I prepared for the hearing. "I received a strange call from someone claiming to be a community leader in your neighborhood," he began awkwardly. "They expressed concerns about your character and suggested we might want to reconsider your recent promotion." My blood ran cold at the realization that Alina had attempted to threaten my livelihood through her country club connections. "I apologize for any awkwardness," I responded. "I am currently involved in a dispute with our HOA over some questionable practices. It appears they are attempting to apply pressure through various channels." "I figured it was something like that," my supervisor replied. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Your work speaks for itself. We are not concerned." The relief I felt was quickly replaced by renewed determination. Alina's willingness to target my professional reputation demonstrated just how far she would go to maintain control. What had begun as a simple dispute over boat parking had evolved into something far more significant, a challenge to a system of power that had gone unchecked for over a decade. As I prepared to leave for the hearing, I received another security alert on my phone. The footage showed someone approaching my boat in the early morning darkness. Upon closer inspection, I recognized the treasurer's teenage son. The video clearly captured him using a key to scratch "Move IT" into the hull of my boat before smashing several pieces of navigation equipment with a hammer. I immediately called the police to report the vandalism and trespassing, downloading the footage to share with responding officers. The board had made a catastrophic tactical error, transforming our dispute from a regulatory matter into a criminal one. As I reported the crime, I realized Eleanor had fundamentally misjudged both my determination and my preparation. The community center meeting room felt deliberately cold as I arrived 15 minutes early for the hearing, my attorney Patricia Chen beside me carrying a leather portfolio bulging with documents. Several board members were already seated at the long table at the front, their hushed conversation ceasing abruptly as we entered. Eleanor sat in the center position, her expression momentarily betraying surprise at the sight of legal representation before quickly composing herself. "We typically do not allow attorneys in internal HOA matters," she stated, her tone conveying annoyance thinly disguised as procedural concern. Patricia smiled professionally. "The bylaws make no such prohibition, Ms. Winters. Article 12, Section 4 specifically guarantees homeowners the right to representation in all matters involving potential financial penalties exceeding $1,000. Eleanor's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. More surprising than her reaction was the growing number of residents filing into the room. What should have been a sparsely attended morning meeting was quickly becoming standing room only as neighbors filled the available chairs. Richard Barnes, the treasurer, leaned over to whisper something to Eleanor. She nodded before calling the meeting to order precisely at 8:00 a.m. This special hearing addresses ongoing violations at 1842 Lakeside Drive, Eleanor announced, reading from a prepared statement. The homeowner has failed to comply with Section 8.3, prohibiting watercraft storage in residential areas. Accumulated fines now total $2,800 with an additional $100 daily penalty, continuing to accrue. She looked up, fixing me with a stern gaze. "We typically allow 5 minutes for homeowner appeals, after which the board will deliberate in closed session." Patricia spoke in the measured tones that justified her hourly rate. "My client requires adequate time to present substantial evidence of rights infringement and procedural violations. Bylaws establish no time limit for hearings, particularly in cases involving potential liens or significant financial penalties." A murmur rippled through the gathered residents. Eleanor appeared momentarily flustered before nodding reluctantly. "Very well. You may proceed with your presentation." I approached the small podium, placing my documents on its surface with deliberate calm despite my racing heartbeat. Taking a deep breath, I began presenting the evidence I had compiled over the previous weeks. "Thank you for this opportunity to address the board and my neighbors," I began. "I would like to start by establishing the historical context of my property rights, which predate the formation of this HOA by 15 years. For the next 20 minutes, I methodically presented the original waterfront deed covenants, highlighting specific language granting permanent and transferable rights to reasonable watercraft access and storage. The room grew increasingly quiet as I explained how these foundational property rights had been systematically eroded through incremental bylaw amendments over the years. These amendments, I continued, displaying a timeline of changes, were passed during specially called meetings with minimal notice, often when many residents were away. The HOA bylaws require two-thirds approval from all affected waterfront property owners for changes impacting riparian rights. Documentation shows these thresholds were never met. Alina interrupted, her voice sharp. These procedural concerns are irrelevant to your current violation. The rules as they exist today clearly prohibit your boat storage arrangement. On the contrary, I countered, procedural validity is fundamental to enforcement authority. But let us move to more recent concerns. I displayed enlarged photographs from my security cameras showing Alina and Richard inspecting my property without permission. The images were crystal clear, showing them measuring distances and taking photographs while standing on my property. This unauthorized property inspection on March 18th violates both state trespass laws and Article 7 of our own bylaws, which requires 48-hour written notice before any board member may enter private property for inspection purposes. Whispers rippled through the audience as I continued building my case. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaware of Alina's unauthorized actions. The room fell completely silent when I reached the most damning evidence. Perhaps most concerning is the clear conflict of interest in enforcement priorities, I stated, distributing copies of business registration documents. Cedar Lake Marine Storage, the only approved off-site boat storage facility, lists board president Alina Winters as a 25% owner. This constitutes a textbook conflict of interest requiring immediate recusal from all boat-related enforcement decisions. Alina's face flushed deep red. That business relationship has no bearing on enforcement of community standards. I am simply a passive investor. The state statute on HOA governance explicitly prohibits board members from financial benefit in enforcement actions, Patricia interjected. Section 720.303 requires full disclosure of all business interests that might benefit from board decisions. No such disclosure appears in meeting minutes from the past 5 years. The room erupted in conversation as residents processed this revelation. Several board members turned to Alina with questioning expressions, clearly hearing this information for the first time. I continued before she could regain control of the meeting. Finally, I must address the criminal vandalism of my property that occurred this morning, I said, connecting my laptop to the meeting room projector. At approximately 5:30 a.m. today, this security footage captured Richard Barnes' son Jason deliberately damaging my boat and navigation equipment. The room fell deathly silent as the video played, clearly showing the teenager scratching Move IT into the hull before smashing equipment with a hammer. Richard Barnes stood abruptly, his face pale. "This is outrageous. You have no proof that." "The police have the footage and have already identified your son," I replied calmly. "Officers are currently processing the vandalism scene. They will want to speak with both you and Jason later today." Alina attempted to adjourn the meeting, but 2 board members objected, openly questioning her actions for the first time in public memory. The professional facade crumbled as board members began arguing among themselves about proper procedures and next steps. Patricia leaned close to whisper in my ear, "You have them on the defensive now. They never expected this level of preparation." An older board member named Helen Johnson, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. I move that we immediately suspend all fines related to this property pending full legal review of the original covenant rights. Additionally, I move that we engage independent counsel to review the conflict of interest concerns raised today. Alina appeared stunned by this rebellion from a typically compliant board member. That is not necessary. We can handle this internally. I second the motion, interrupted another board member, a retired judge who had recently joined the community. And I further move that we table all enforcement actions for 30 days while we conduct a comprehensive review of our amendment procedures. A formal vote was called, passing 4-2 despite Alina's opposition. As the meeting concluded in disarray, several neighbors approached to express support and share their own stories of questionable enforcement. Tom gave me a subtle thumbs up from across the room, his expression conveying both congratulations and warning. This victory, while significant, would likely trigger escalation rather than resolution. Walking to my car, I noticed Alina engaged in intense conversation with Richard, both casting occasional glances in my direction. Their expressions made it clear that while I had won this battle, the war was far from over. Notice of an emergency bylaw amendment meeting appeared on community bulletin boards just 2 days after the hearing. The hastily printed flyers announced a special session to consider critical updates to community standards regarding waterfront properties. The proposed changes would retroactively strengthen boat restrictions and specifically remove outdated waterfront exemptions no longer relevant to community standards. This desperate maneuver revealed Alina's true concern about my documentation and the threat it posed to her authority. She was attempting to change the rules mid-dispute to undermine my legal position. The timing could not have been more transparent. The most surprising development came later that day when my email inbox began filling with messages from neighbors. What started as a trickle soon became a flood of shared experiences. They fined us $500 for planting red geraniums instead of approved white ones. Our children were banned from the community pool for 2 weeks because our dues payment was processed 1 day late. We received violation notices weekly after questioning the landscaping contract awarded to Alina's brother-in-law. Each message revealed a pattern of selective enforcement and personal vendettas stretching back years. Many residents had simply capitulated rather than face escalating harassment. Others had sold their homes and moved away, unable to endure the constant pressure. We began meeting discreetly at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood, forming an informal coalition of the aggrieved. During our first gathering, 12 residents shared stories of questionable fines and enforcement actions. By our third meeting, attendance had grown to over 20 homeowners, representing nearly a quarter of the community. She threatened to report my home-based consulting business to zoning authorities after I questioned the reserve fund accounting, explained a woman named Linda, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. I paid the ridiculous fine for my bamboo plant being 3 inches too tall and stayed quiet ever since. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Those who questioned authority were targeted immediately with intensified scrutiny. Most residents eventually surrendered to avoid the constant stress and financial penalties. As our group grew, word of the dispute reached beyond our neighborhood. A local news reporter contacted me after hearing rumors of the controversy, expressing interest in investigating patterns of HOA overreach across the county. While I provided general information about governance concerns, I refrained from sharing specific documents, knowing that public exposure would only intensify the conflict at this stage. Alina's counterattack turned increasingly personal. My supervisor mentioned concerns raised by community leaders about my character, a transparent attempt to threaten my livelihood through Eliner's country club connections. Someone named Eliner Winters called suggesting we might want to reconsider your recent promotion, he explained awkwardly. She implied you were a troublemaker who did not respect community standards or authority. The attempt to damage my professional reputation demonstrated how far beyond reasonable governance this dispute had evolved. Fortunately, my workplace performance spoke for itself, and my supervisor recognized the call for what it was, an inappropriate attempt at leveraging personal connections to apply pressure. The final escalation came 1 week before the scheduled emergency meeting. Returning home from work, I discovered my boat's navigation equipment smashed and Move IT scratched deeply into the fiberglass hull. The damage would cost thousands to repair, but more valuable was the security footage capturing the act in high definition. The video clearly showed Richard's teenage son Jason approaching my boat at 5:30 a.m., using a key to vandalize the hull before methodically smashing equipment with a hammer. The deliberate nature of the destruction and the obvious connection to board leadership transformed our dispute from regulatory to criminal. I immediately called the police to report the vandalism and trespassing, providing the footage to responding officers. Their reaction confirmed the seriousness of the situation. "This is clear criminal mischief and destruction of property," the officer stated, reviewing the footage. "The damage value makes this a felony offense. We will need to interview the young man and his parents." As I filed the police report, I recognized that the board had made a catastrophic tactical error. Their escalation had provided precisely the evidence I needed to demonstrate the personal nature of enforcement actions and the improper influence of board leadership. That evening, my cell phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The caller identified himself as Michael Richards, a reporter from the local newspaper. "I understand there have been some unusual developments in your HOA dispute," he began. "Several sources have mentioned police involvement and allegations of selective enforcement." I chose my words carefully, aware that public exposure would irreversibly change the nature of our community conflict. "There have been some concerning incidents, including criminal vandalism that appears connected to the ongoing dispute. Beyond that, I would prefer not to comment while legal proceedings are active." His next words confirmed my suspicions about Eliner's network. "That is interesting, because Board President Winters contacted us yesterday suggesting a story about problem residents destroying property values in Cedar Lake Estates. She specifically mentioned your address." Eliner was attempting to control the narrative through her media connections, unaware that her actions were creating a more comprehensive record of harassment and abuse of authority. As I ended the call with the reporter, I realized we had reached a point where resolution would require formal legal intervention beyond our community's internal processes. The county courthouse imposed a sense of gravity as our case number was called. After months of escalation, harassment, and community division, the matter of Homeowner versus Cedar Lake Estates HOA would finally receive judicial review. The judge, a silver-haired woman with penetrating eyes and a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, studied the thick case file before addressing the attorneys. Eliner sat at the respondent's table with the HOA's attorney, her typically confident demeanor notably subdued. The criminal charges against Richard's son for vandalism had forced several board members to distance themselves from her leadership, and only 2 loyalists remained in court to support her position. "This court has reviewed the extensive documentation submitted by both parties," the judge began. What began as a simple dispute over boat storage has evolved into serious allegations of governance irregularities, procedural violations, and conflicts of interest. For the next hour, both sides presented their arguments. When my turn came, I methodically outlined the chronology of events, supported by the original property deed, documented conflicts of interest, and evidence of selective enforcement patterns. Patricia expertly guided the presentation, highlighting the legal principles at stake rather than the personal conflicts that had dominated recent months. The HOA attorney appeared increasingly uncomfortable as the judge asked pointed questions about notification procedures and board election irregularities. By the time both sides had presented, the momentum had clearly shifted in our favor. The judge's ruling came with decisive clarity. The court finds that the waterfront property rights explicitly protected in the original covenant supersede later HOA amendments that failed to secure proper consent from affected owners. The respondent HOA lacked authority to impose fines relating to boat storage for properties with deeded riparian rights. She continued, addressing broader concerns. More disturbing are the governance irregularities evident in the record. The court orders an immediate audit of HOA financial practices and board election procedures to be conducted by an independent third party. Furthermore, all board members with business interests potentially benefiting from HOA enforcement actions must either divest those interests or resign from leadership positions. The impact of the ruling extended far beyond my individual case, establishing precedent for all waterfront properties and fundamentally reshaping governance procedures. Aliner's face remained impassive, but her white-knuckled grip on the table edge revealed her recognition that her reign had effectively ended. The aftermath transformed our community in ways I could never have anticipated. Aliner resigned within weeks, followed by the treasurer who faced separate legal issues related to his son's vandalism. The interim board, led by Helen Johnson, initiated a comprehensive review of all bylaws and enforcement actions from the previous 5 years. Most surprisingly, several neighbors nominated me for a position on the new board, seeing me as someone committed to fair governance rather than power consolidation. After careful consideration, I accepted, believing that balanced leadership would better serve our community than continued conflict. Today, my boat sits properly stored on my waterfront property, a symbol not of defiance, but of reasonable rights properly defended. The new board has established clear guidelines respecting original property rights while maintaining appropriate community standards. Meetings now.